33 missed calls. That's what my phone showed when I finally pulled it out of my jacket pocket at a rest stop on I-40, somewhere between a business dinner I didn't want to attend and a home I thought was safe. 33 calls from Elena, my wife of 11 years, a woman who never called more than twice even when the water heater flooded the basement. My hands were shaking before I even hit play on the first voicemail, and by the third one, where her voice cracked into something I had never heard from her before, not fear exactly, but a kind of controlled panic. The panic of someone trying to stay calm for the sake of whoever might be listening. I was already back in my car, running red lights I shouldn't have run, doing 80 on residential streets, praying to a God I hadn't spoken to in years that whatever was happening at my house wasn't what my imagination had already decided it was. When I turned onto Birchwood Lane, the street where I had watched my daughter learn to ride a bike, where I had shoveled snow every February for over a decade, there were 4 police cars parked at odd angles across my lawn, their lights washing the front of my house in red and blue, and neighbors standing on their porches in bathrobes, watching, whispering, filming with their phones like my life had become the evening's entertainment. I don't remember parking. I don't remember getting out of the car. I remember an officer's hand on my chest telling me to stay back, and I remember screaming Elena's name until a face appeared behind him, pale, tear-streaked, but alive, and something in my chest that had been crushing itself into a fist for the last 40 minutes finally let go. To understand how I ended up standing on my own front lawn, restrained by a stranger in a uniform while my wife stood wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, you have to go back almost 2 years to a decision I made that felt at the time like the smartest move of my professional life. My name is Daniel Reyes, and for the better part of 15 years I had built a mid-sized renovation and construction company from nothing but a used pickup truck, a business license, and a willingness to work Saturdays that most men my age had long since given up. I started Reyes Restoration doing kitchen remodels for people in my own neighborhood, then bathroom additions, then eventually whole home renovations for clients who found me through word of mouth because I never cut corners and I always showed up when I said I would. By the time I turned 42, I had 11 employees, a warehouse full of equipment, and a reputation in our county that meant something. What I didn't have was capital, the kind of real capital you need to bid on the bigger commercial jobs, the multi-unit apartment renovations, the school district contracts, the work that could take a company from comfortable to genuinely wealthy. That's where Marcus Whitfield came in. Marcus and I met at a Rotary Club fundraiser of all places, one of those events where men in blazers stand around a hotel ballroom pretending to care about a silent auction while actually sizing each other up for opportunity. Marcus had money, real money, inherited from a father who'd made a fortune in commercial real estate, and he had the kind of easy charisma that made you feel like the most important person in the room within 30 seconds of shaking his hand. He complimented my work, said he'd driven past 2 of my recent projects and been impressed, and within a month he was sitting across from me at my kitchen table with a proposal. He would inject $200,000 into Reyes Restoration in exchange for a 40% partnership stake, and with his capital and his connections, we could start bidding on the contracts I'd always dreamed about. Elena was skeptical from the start. She has always been the more cautious one between us. A forensic accountant by training who spent 12 years reviewing financial statements for a regional bank before going independent, and she has a nose for numbers that don't add up the way most people have a nose for smoke. She sat in on that first dinner with Marcus, and afterward, once he'd left, she told me something felt off about him, that his numbers were vague, that a man with that much genuine capital usually didn't need to move so fast to close a deal. I told her she was being overly cautious, that this was the opportunity of a lifetime, and that not every wealthy man was hiding something. I wish I could tell you I regret that conversation, but the truth is more complicated than regret. I believed what I said. I wanted to believe it. And for the first year, Marcus's money did exactly what he promised. We landed a contract to renovate 3 elementary schools in the district, then a partnership with a property management company to update 40 rental units across 2 apartment complexes. Revenue tripled. I hired 6 more employees. I bought Elena the kitchen she'd been dreaming about since we got married, the one with the marble island and the farmhouse sink, and for a while, life felt like it was finally catching up to the work I'd put into it. The first crack appeared quietly, the way most betrayals do, not with an explosion but with a discrepancy so small it was almost invisible. Elena had taken over managing the company's books about 8 months after Marcus came on board, partly because I trusted her more than any outside accountant, and partly because, frankly, we needed to save money on bookkeeping fees. She noticed it on a Tuesday evening in March, sitting at our dining room table with her laptop and a stack of invoices, the kind of ordinary evening that later becomes impossible to forget because of what it led to. A supplier invoice for lumber and drywall on the second apartment complex job was listed at $11,000 more than the actual delivered materials, according to the site manager's own inventory logs. One invoice, she told herself, could be a clerical error, but she kept looking, the way people who are good at their jobs can't help but keep looking once something feels wrong, and over the following weeks she found 6 more discrepancies, all on jobs where Marcus had personally handled vendor relationships, all slightly different in method but consistent in one troubling way. They all funneled excess payments through a supplier called Ironclad Materials Group, company that when Elena searched for it had almost no online presence, a P.O. box for an address, and an incorporation date just 4 months before Marcus joined our business. She didn't tell me right away. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to what happened later. Elena is careful by nature, and she knew that accusing my business partner, a man I considered a friend by that point, a man who had been to our house for dinner a dozen times and had helped my son with his math homework once when I was stuck on a job site, would blow up not just our finances but our entire lives if she was wrong. So she spent nearly 3 months quietly building a file, cross-referencing bank statements, tracking down the actual delivery records from our suppliers, even driving out to the address listed for Ironclad Materials Group on a Saturday when she told me she was running errands, only to find an empty storage unit facility with no company by that name registered to any unit. What she found, piece by piece, was a scheme that was almost elegant in its simplicity. Marcus was creating fake vendor invoices through Ironclad, a shell company he controlled, billing our business for materials that were either never delivered or delivered at a fraction of the invoice cost and pocketing the difference. Over 18 months, based on what Elena eventually documented, he had siphoned somewhere between $140,000 and $160,000 out of a company that I had built with my hands and my back in 15 years of Saturdays. The night Elena finally told me, we sat at that same dining room table until nearly 2 in the morning, and I remember feeling something I can only describe as a kind of internal collapse, the sensation of a floor giving way beneath a house you thought was built on bedrock. My first instinct, and I'm not proud of this, was denial, not because I didn't trust Elena's numbers, but because accepting them meant accepting that I had been played, that my judgment, the very thing I'd built a business and a reputation on, had failed me completely when it mattered most. Elena didn't push. She just laid the documents in front of me, one by one, patient the way she always is, and let the evidence speak instead of her opinion, because she knew that in the end I needed to arrive at the truth myself rather than have it handed to me. By the time the sun came up, I wasn't in denial anymore. I was something colder and more focused, and it was Elena, not me, who first said the word that would define the next year of our lives: documentation. She told me that if we confronted Marcus without an airtight case, he would simply destroy evidence, deny everything, and potentially turn the accusation around on us, since his name was still on 40% of a company with his signature on plenty of the same paperwork. We needed to build a case so complete that there would be no room for him to maneuver. What followed was, in hindsight, one of the most disciplined periods of my life, though at the time it felt like walking through a minefield in slow motion, smiling at a man across conference tables and job sites while knowing exactly what he'd done to us. Elena brought in a forensic accountant she'd worked with years earlier, a meticulous woman named Priya Nakamura who had testified as an expert witness in fraud cases before and who reviewed Elena's work not to check it, but to strengthen it, adding layers of documentation that would hold up not just to scrutiny but to cross-examination. We consulted a business attorney, David Osei, who specialized in partnership disputes and fraud litigation, and who explained to us, in a conversation that felt like it lasted a lifetime, exactly how fragile our position was and exactly how careful we needed to be. Because Marcus was a registered partner with legal access to company accounts, simply firing him or freezing him out could expose us to a countersuit, and because some of the fraudulent transactions had occurred on jobs where my own signature appeared on approval documents, even though I'd trusted Marcus's judgment on vendor selection, there was a real risk that an aggressive attorney could paint the fraud as a joint failure rather than a unilateral theft. Osei's advice was blunt: don't move until you can move once decisively, with law enforcement and civil litigation ready simultaneously, because you will likely only get one real opportunity before Marcus realizes what's happening and starts protecting himself. For nearly a year, I worked beside a man who had stolen from me, laughed at his jokes at company barbecues, discussed expansion plans with him as though we were still building something together, all while Elena, Priya, and eventually a private investigator named Tom Bracer that Osei brought in, quietly assembled a case that grew thicker by the month. Tom's contribution turned out to be the piece that changed everything, because he was the one who discovered why Marcus needed the money in the first place, and the reason wasn't the kind of cartoonish greed you'd expect from a movie villain. Marcus Whitfield, the man with the family fortune and the effortless charm, had lost the vast majority of his inheritance to a series of bad real estate speculations in another state, deals that had collapsed during a regional market downturn 2 years before he ever walked into that Rotary Club fundraiser. The $200,000 he'd invested in Reyes Restoration wasn't excess capital from a wealthy man looking for a smart opportunity. It was very close to the last liquid money he had, and once it was gone, the fraud through Ironclad Materials Group wasn't a scheme for luxury. It was a desperate attempt to keep up appearances, to service debts on properties he still owned but could no longer afford, to maintain the image of the man everyone believed him to be. Understanding that didn't make what he did to us forgivable, but it made him human in a way that mattered later, and it also gave us leverage, because a man protecting a fragile financial house of cards is a man who will do almost anything to avoid public exposure. There was a moment, about 10 months into this quiet investigation, when I almost lost my composure entirely, and it's the moment that connects directly to the police cars on my lawn. Elena had discovered something new, something that escalated everything. Marcus had started making inquiries, subtle ones, about our home security, about Elena's work schedule, about whether she still kept physical copies of financial records at the house rather than only in the office. She'd heard about it secondhand, from our bookkeeper, Janice. who had innocently mentioned to Marcus that Elena sometimes worked from home in the evenings, not realizing the danger in that small piece of information. What we didn't know and what only became clear afterward was that Marcus had grown genuinely desperate by that point, having discovered on his own that Elena had been asking pointed questions of a supplier connected to Ironclad Materials Group, questions specific enough that they spooked him into believing his fraud might already be unraveling. A cornered man, even a nonviolent one, even a man who had never been physically aggressive a day in his life, can do things he never imagined himself capable of when the alternative is public disgrace, criminal charges, and the complete collapse of the identity he'd spent his whole life constructing. On the night of the 33 phone calls, I was at a dinner meeting nearly 90 minutes away, discussing a potential contract with a hospital renovation project, a meeting Marcus had conveniently begged off attending due to a supposed family obligation. Elena was home alone, our son at a friend's house for a sleepover, working late at the dining room table on updated documentation for OSE when she heard the back door, the one off the kitchen that led to our small deck, being forced open. She told me later that her first instinct was that it must be an animal, a raccoon rattling the door, because who would break into a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood at 8 in the evening? But then she heard footsteps, deliberate ones, moving through the kitchen, and she'd something that in that moment probably saved not just her safety but the entire case we'd spent a year building. She didn't run for the door. She grabbed her laptop, the one containing the master file of every piece of evidence against Marcus, backed away into the downstairs bathroom, locked the door, and called 911 in a whisper, giving the dispatcher our address and telling them someone had broken into her home. Then, because the dispatcher told her to stay on the line, but she was terrified her whispering would be heard through the door, she muted the call and began texting me at the same time she was calling, over and over, 33 times in total between calls and follow-up text that I wouldn't see until I was already speeding home, because my phone had been in airplane mode during the dinner meeting. The intruder, as the police would later confirm, spent almost 11 minutes in our house before fleeing out the same back door when he heard sirens approaching, 11 minutes in which he went straight to the small home office off our living room, not touching the television, not touching Elena's jewelry box in the bedroom upstairs, not behaving like any ordinary burglar, but instead going directly to the file cabinet where Elena had, until 3 weeks earlier, kept physical backup copies of financial documents, copies she had since moved to a safety deposit box after OC advised her to diversify where the evidence was stored. The intruder found nothing but old tax returns and warranty paperwork because Elena's caution, the same caution Marcus had once dismissed as excessive, had already moved the real evidence somewhere he couldn't reach. When police arrived, Elena was still locked in that bathroom, and it took nearly 4 minutes of them clearing the house before she felt safe enough to unlock the door. 4 minutes that felt, she told me later, like the longest of her life. By the time I arrived, the intruder was long gone, but a responding officer running facial recognition footage from a doorbell camera 2 houses down against the county database had already flagged a partial match, a man in a dark jacket whose gait and build resembled, closely enough to warrant investigation, a name that would come up again within days, Marcus Whitfield. I won't pretend the days immediately following were anything but chaos. Elena was shaken in a way I had never seen her, jumping at sounds, sleeping with the bedroom door locked even with me beside her, and there is a particular kind of guilt that settles into a man's chest when he realizes that his own business decisions, made in good faith years earlier, ultimately put his wife in danger, and no amount of logical explanation about not being able to see the future fully absolves that feeling. But Elena, even shaken, even frightened, was the one who reminded me, sitting on our bed 3 nights later while our son slept down the hall, that we had spent a year preparing for exactly this kind of moment, that everything we'd built with Ose and Pri and Tom Bracer was designed for the possibility that Marcus, backed into a corner, might do something rash, and that now was not the time to freeze but the time to move. The break-in, terrifying as it was, had also handed us something we hadn't fully had before, a criminal act connected, even if not yet definitively proven, to a man already under quiet financial investigation, and a police department now independently interested in Marcus Whitfield for reasons entirely separate from our civil case. OC moved fast once the police investigation into the break-in gained traction, working in coordination with the detective assigned to the burglary, who quickly discovered that Marcus's financial situation gave him a plausible motive to want to intimidate or silence anyone investigating his business dealings. We finally executed the plan we'd spent nearly a year preparing. On a Thursday morning, OC filed a civil complaint against Marcus for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, supported by Priya's forensic accounting report documenting every fraudulent transaction through Ironclad Materials Group, while simultaneously the district attorney's office, working from both the burglary investigation and the financial evidence OC had proactively shared, opened a criminal inquiry into Marcus for both the break-in and the underlying fraud. We had timed the filing for a Thursday specifically because Marcus had a standing meeting with his remaining investors and business associates every Thursday afternoon at a downtown business club, a meeting he would be legally required to disclose the pending litigation at given securities and partnership disclosure obligations OC had researched carefully. I wasn't there when it happened by design because OC felt my presence might escalate things unnecessarily, but Tom Bracer was discreetly, and he told me afterward that Marcus's composure, The same effortless charm that had once impressed me across a Rotary Club ballroom simply evaporated when a process server approached his table in front of 6 other businessmen and handed him the complaint. What happened over the following months was not the kind of dramatic courtroom confrontation you might expect from how this story began. No shouting matches, no dramatic reveals in front of a jury, because the truth is that cases built on solid documentation rarely need dramatics. Faced with Priya's forensic report, which traced every dollar with a precision that left no reasonable room for alternative explanation, and facing a separate criminal charge for the burglary that the detective's investigation eventually confirmed through cell tower data, placing Marcus's phone in our neighborhood that evening, Marcus's attorney began negotiating a settlement within 6 weeks rather than risk a criminal trial that could result in years of prison time on top of the fraud charges. The settlement Ose negotiated required Marcus to surrender his entire 40% ownership stake in Reyes Restoration without compensation, to repay $155,000 in restitution over a structured payment plan secured against the few remaining assets he still owned, and to plead guilty to a reduced burglary charge that came with probation, mandatory counseling, and a permanent restraining order requiring him to stay away from both myself and Elena and to have no further contact with our business in any capacity. It wasn't the dramatic public humiliation that some angrier part of me had wanted in those first raw weeks after the break-in. OC was clear with us early on that revenge fantasies rarely serve a client's actual interests, and that the goal was restoration, not spectacle, recovering what we could, protecting our family, and rebuilding the business without Marcus's shadow hanging over it. In the end, that restraint served us better than anger would have, because it meant Marcus's cooperation in unwinding certain contracts and vendor relationships happened faster, and with fewer complications than a scorched earth legal war would have allowed. The business itself took nearly a year to fully stabilize. I bought out Marcus's forfeited stake using a combination of the restitution payments and a modest business loan, this time working with a lender Elena vetted personally, line by line, before I signed anything, a small joke between us now that has become something more like a permanent policy. We lost 2 contracts in the immediate aftermath, clients who got nervous when word of the litigation became public, but we kept 9, including both apartment complex renovations, because our actual work had never been the problem, and clients who knew me personally trusted that the fraud had been Marcus's doing and not mine, especially once the settlement became a matter of public record. Janice, our bookkeeper, stayed on, mortified that she'd unknowingly given Marcus information that made the break-in possible, and I made sure she understood repeatedly that none of what happened was her fault, that Marcus was a manipulator who had spent years perfecting the art of extracting information from people who trusted him, and that the failure of judgment, if there was one to assign, belonged to me for bringing him into our lives in the first place. Priya Nakamura became our permanent forensic consultant for any contract over a certain size, a standing relationship that has probably saved us from at least 2 other bad deals since, because now caution isn't something Elena has to fight for in our house, it's simply how we operate. As for Marcus, I saw him only once more at a probation-mandated restitution hearing about 8 months after the settlement, where he looked smaller somehow than the man who'd once sat across my kitchen table promising to change my life. He didn't look at me when the judge confirmed his payment plan was on schedule, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't feel the surge of satisfaction I'd expected to feel in that moment. What I felt instead was closer to relief, the particular relief of a chapter finally completely closing, of a threat that had lived in the corner of our lives for nearly 2 years finally losing its power over us. Elena and I talked about it in the car afterward, about how strange it was that the man who had once felt like such an enormous force in our lives, someone whose approval and partnership had once seemed essential to everything we were building, had simply become a small, sad footnote, a cautionary tale we would probably tell our son one day. Not as a story about villains and heroes, but as a story about the importance of paying attention when something feels wrong, and about trusting the people who are careful enough to notice what you might miss. These days, Reyes Restoration is bigger than it ever was under the partnership with Marcus, not because his money had ever really been the thing that made us successful, but because the discipline Elena forced into every part of our operations during that terrible year, the documentation, the verification, the refusal to take anything at face value, turned out to be exactly what the business needed to grow sustainably rather than just quickly. We renovated a 3rd elementary school in the district last spring, and Elena stood beside me at the ribbon cutting, no longer flinching at footsteps behind her, no longer sleeping with the bedroom door locked, though she still to this day keeps backup copies of anything important in 3 separate places, a habit I've never once teased her for and never will. Some nights, usually around the anniversary of that night with the police cars on our lawn, we sit on our back deck, the same one whose door Marcus once forced open, and we talk about how close we came, not to losing money, though we very nearly did, but to losing the sense of safety that makes a house feel like a home rather than just a building you happen to sleep in. What saved us wasn't luck, and it certainly wasn't any dramatic act of heroism on my part. It was patience and documentation, and a wife who noticed an $11,000 discrepancy on an ordinary Tuesday evening and refused to look away from it just because looking away would have been easier. That, in the end, is the only kind of justice that ever really lasts, the kind built slowly on truth, rather than the kind that arrives in a single dramatic moment and burns out just as fast. The police cars are long gone from our lawn now. The neighbors stopped whispering about it within a few months. And our house, once again, is simply our house, quiet, ordinary, and finally, completely ours.